Benito Mussolini, in his famous doctrine of fascism, stated, "It is quite logical for a new doctrine to make use of the still vital elements of other doctrines. No doctrine was ever born quite new and bright and unheard of. No doctrine can boast absolute originality. It is always connected, it only historically, with those which preceded it and those which will follow it." Thus, the scientific socialism of Marx links up to the utopian socialism of the Fouriers, the Owens, the Saint-Simons. Thus, the liberalism of the 19th century traces its origins back to the Illuministic movement of the 18th, and the doctrines of democracy to those of the encyclopedists. All doctrines aim at directing the activities of men toward a given objective, but these activities in their turn react on the doctrine, modifying and adjusting it to new needs or outstripping it. So, in regards to fascism, where does it derive its theoretical origins? Well, from many places. To name a few quickly, there was the alliance during the Third French Republic between right-wing nationalists and left-wing syndicalists that sought to overthrow the bourgeois liberal democracy that existed during such an historical period. There was the Marxist writer Georges Eugene Sorel, whose human spirit expressed through his literary work gave rise to the vitality and passionate character of Italian fascism. There were plenty of nationalists and pan-Italianists who inhabited the Italian nation-state prior to the existence of fascism and Mussolini's political activism. There existed also in ancient Rome and Greece the essential spiritual elements in their people that fascism seeks to revive within the modern era. Julius Caesar, who Benito Mussolini claimed was the greatest man to ever live, the heroic and populist dictator over the Roman Empire, the state which sought to spread its beauty across the earth. He was also greatly influential to fascism. In addition, there were many former materialists, Marxists, socialists, and leftists who abandoned their support of such ideologies and instead found a revolutionary nationalism with their conversion to idealist philosophy. However, this is a video about none of such things. These are all incredibly interesting subjects and certainly worthy of study for those wanting to learn more about the essence of what fascism is. But right now we're going to discuss what I believe has been the single largest inspiration within fascism, both as a political religion and as a movement, that being Friedrich Hegel. Now, you may be wondering, what's a Hegel? Well, this mythical creature. Yes, a Hegel is a strange entity, a German metaphysician who specialized in the theory that existence is a construct of active consciousness. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel believed that the reason anything is the way it is, from chairs to beds to houses, to ourselves as living human beings, awake and able to conceive what's visually presented, is because the mind determines what is and isn't real. So for example, the only reason the keyboard I'm typing on right now to write this script is existent, part of my reality, is because I believe it exists, that I brought it into existence through the ability of my mind. If I didn't believe in the keyboard I'm using right now, it wouldn't be in front of me. It wouldn't exist at all. If I were to suddenly lose belief in this keyboard, then, well, it'd disappear. This is the same with all properties, and by extension, all other human beings. The world is mentally constructed, able to exist and continue its existence because we conceive it with our minds. If the mind were to become inactive, however, everything would vanish. This means that in order to sustain the current status of the world, to dwell, to progress, to regress, the activity of the mind must be constant. If one were to lose their ability to think, to conceive, to know, then the world would have stopped, because one weren't there to conceive it. To better understand Hegel's theory of mind, allow me to quote him. "The proposition that the finite is ideal constitutes idealism. The idealism of philosophy consists in nothing else than in recognizing that the finite has no variable being. Every philosophy is essentially an idealism, or at least has idealism for its principle, and the question then is only how far this principle is actually carried out. A philosophy which ascribed veritable, ultimate, absolute being to finite existence as such would not deserve the name of philosophy. The principles of ancient or modern philosophies, water or matter or atoms, are thoughts, universal, ideal entities, not things as they immediately present themselves to us. In fact, what is only the one concrete whole from which the movements are inseparable." This view that particles, atoms, and molecules, all chemical elements, are an imaginative creation of the mind, provides Friedrich Hegel the ability to remark that reality is dependent entirely upon the mind, and a mind-independent reality is thus impossible. Not only is it impossible, to Hegel it was downright absurd. The world is conceived differently by every individual, our minds constructing alternative perspectives, perceptions, and thoughts. Our opinions are different, our backgrounds are different, so the fact that there could exist one wholly connected concrete reality would deny what Hegel viewed as the metaphysical basis of human nature. Friedrich Hegel developed this theory of subject and object. The subject was the active consciousness, the mind, the one who conceives. Men and women, no matter their circumstances, as long as they have the ability to think and to interact cognitively with reality, find themselves as irrationally acting individuals due to a disconnected sense of reality. One person conceives the world differently from another, politically, morally, socially. This causes conflict, clashes, war. This diversity within our minds, it sets people apart, forcing them to seek out others who have a similar conception of what's real to them. In this view of metaphysics, there exists no self-regulation of human beings able to prevent mistakes, bad actions, and immorality from taking place. Some of the worst crimes in this world, throughout history, have been committed in the conception, from the perpetrator, their actions were somehow ethically just. What's to hold them together? Who's to hold them together? And make sure society has an adequate level of social order? Well, we'll get to that shortly with Hegel's vision of the spiritual state. The subject is the one who conceives the object. An object, in the Hegelian sense, is material appearing property or subject of interest that exists due to one's conception of it, their belief in its existence. You may conceive characters within a fantasy story as being fictional characters, just that and nothing more. This does nothing to bring them into existence because one actively recognizes they're not real. But if one were to generally conceive them as existent and part of what we refer to as the physical world, then they're real. They've been real all along, but only because someone was willing to believe in them, likely as a result of their faith and devotion to them. The object, because it exists only so far as it's able to be conceived, is dependent upon the subject who conceives. Because there exists no material reality in Hegel's view, this means that the subject and object are one and the same. If the subject weren't believing in the existence and manifestation of the object, it wouldn't have been brought into existence. It wouldn't exist at any point in time. Time and space, too, are a construct of the mind by the principles of idealism. Matter exists only so far as we conceive it, the idealists claim, and therefore is not the foundation for realizing truth or myth. The nature of the mind, when focused on an object, is giving meaning to whichever property or political notion being examined, just as long as it's examined and not forgotten. So let's put this into perspective so that everything can make calm, clear sense. Reality is entirely dependent, not independent, on the activity of the mind, and the belief in whatever is being conceived is real, not merely a figment of the mind, but is concrete, absolute. Therefore, as a natural consequence of this thought, the object is no different from the subject, and is in fact part of the subject, because without the subject, the object wouldn't exist. It can only exist because it's being conceived, and it obviously needs a subject for that. For ages, there's been this question asked to collectivists: how do you determine groups exist? What makes a group exist? If 10 people sit in a room together, had they become any different from when they were apart, separate? And now, the supporters and theoreticians of collectivism can respond with, if individuals can see themselves as a group, they've become a legitimate collective. Since there's no matter which points to the existence of groups, observing that there's no biological difference between one individual roaming the planet on their own, their inherent genetics, for when they're accompanied by others, as you know, nothing about them physically alters, no matter who they've surrounded themselves with, Hegelians and fascists need only to point to the idealist explanation of the universe and of united collectives, not the materialist view. Within materialism, groups cannot exist because only individuals, organically disconnected from one another, unless literally together stitched into a blob of flesh, can be identified as real. No matter implies that one person is the extension of another, the will and consciousness of another. Because objects cannot exist without our consciousness, this naturally applies to fellow human beings, to insects, to birds, to fish, to animals. They all exist because we concede them to. Their existence would vanish if we were to vanish, and not in the material sense. our conception, our mind would vanish, and therefore theirs too. I only exist because people can conceive me, and they only exist because I can conceive them. Therefore, we're just an extension of one another, and would fade away if we didn't have others to make us reality, joined together by an immaterial, entirely spiritual force. That spirit comprises a people, a demographic, a collection of intimately merged tribals or nationals who share a common goal, characteristics of faith and vigor. If we didn't believe in ourselves, our spiritual people, we would cease to exist. Groups may exist under idealism, but only so long as we believe in them, and we attach a certain moral sentiment to them that distinguishes them from others. The term fasces refers to a tied-together bundle of wooden rods, united in solidarity and strengthened unity. Alone, each is a mere stick. Without others around, a stick is almost useless, has very little value. But, when tied together, when made whole, because the person putting them together believes in their formation, is able to conceive the sticks as existing now as one, not independent of one another, but entirely dependent and devoted to one another, the wooden rod now possesses a powerful spirit, one that transcends the empty space of individualism, and is able to realize its unique, beautiful qualities and character. The Italian people, the French people, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Zulus, the Amharic people, they exist as long as they believe they do, as long as they're willing to fight for their national communities. The nations that exist because we're able to bring them into existence, into reality, by means of conception, and achieve absolute greatness comparable to nothing else when actively, consciously moving through space and time as one. Nations are constantly being redefined, and in one sense are entirely socially constructed. A sovereign country is merely a location based upon someone adding in a few geographical outlines to a map, claiming this represents something different somehow about this certain space, even though science says quite the opposite, that nations are man-made and aren't objectively verifiable. From the viewpoint of metaphysical materialism, this is fully accurate. A nation is nothing, just something we've created that hasn't historically existed when human beings have. And this is in the great scheme of things, nations being an extremely recent phenomenon. Prior to European colonialism, Australia, when inhabited by the indigenous aboriginals, was in no way a nation. There were no countries until we decided there should be. So, does that mean countries by no stands exist? Well, materially, no. But spiritually, however, idealism tells a different story. If we conceive a nation as existing, whether or not matter is present, and no matter can be found to show evidence of countries existing, then, and only then, can a nation exist. Australia, as I've mentioned, isn't real, and even within the view of idealism, isn't real either. That's because, even though we can be fooled into believing it exists, there's nothing that truly binds Australians together. As someone who inhabits this desert island, the vast majority of our culture and influence has come from America and Britain. We've never developed a unique identity of our own, largely due to the unfortunate conditions of multiculturalism that are present here. There is no Australian culture, no interesting history for Australia. Therefore, because Australians have been given no justification for why they should believe in themselves as a nation, as there exists no basis for a spiritual essence given to our country, we don't exist. Both materialism and idealism agree upon this point. Now, that being said, a nation can, and in fascism's view, must, as a necessity of waking life, exist, be present and within us. The nation, as with friendship and romantic love, is conditional. You can't unconditionally support a nation. Asking this to fascists, would you support a nation that promotes miscegenation, multiculturalism, modernity, and the promotion of degeneracy? Would you support a nation that cares more for private property than traditional values, than culture, than human life and religion? If a nation cares not for the family, for the church, and actively works against these concepts in favor of progressivism, then, well, the nation should rightfully be dead to you. It shouldn't even call itself a nation. Honestly, since it's done nothing to earn your respect. To lay claim to one's nation as superior to all the other elements of life, and feel a sense of pride being part of it, yet turn around and say that all nations are equal, and that it's okay other nations have been consumed by decadence and a hatred of preserving tradition, It's not to generally love one's nation at all. The nation is a conditionally lovable, conditionally existent construct of the mind, and the state, which has been brought into legal existence, must be shaped socially by the personalities, spirits, ideologies, and uniqueness of the people it governs. It derives its political legitimacy, both the nation and the state, from the minds of all who rest within its geographical confines. Their consciousness must be made intellectually convinced to believe in the nation and the state, and see the nation and the state as natural, spiritual extensions of themselves, their characters merged into these mystical institutions, forming a soul that inhabits the land all stand upon. Nations, in fascism, are defined spiritually because they're believed in, not because of matter, which exists not for nations, but because of minds. Because the people believe in themselves, and would be baffled here that they don't materially exist, since the idea of themselves, their group, has been ingrained into their minds so fiercely, so tightly by the spiritual state, they exist as fact. Idealist metaphysics, if consistently applied, asserts this as reality, the shared consciousness of a national community, confirming it as such. The day they wake up, starting to doubt the legitimacy of the nation and the state, the day the nation and the state die. If they feel connected, that the spiritual nation-state has given them agency, identity, vitality, and love within their lives, because they were able to be unified effectively and efficiently by these abstractions, then the spiritual state has carried out its task extremely well. So, some may ask, if everyone conceives reality differently, which we do, and conception determines what is and isn't real, thus this must mean the mind determines what is and isn't ethically just, right? Well, yes, of course. That's a natural conclusion anyone would arrive at. So they ask, how do we determine morality within the nation? Who sets such a policy if everyone conceives reality alternatively? And that's where the state comes in. The state is the organic entity, existing because of the collective it governs, that sets policy, that forms the law. Since the state is a representation of everyone's consciousness, the deuce, the supreme dictator of the fascist state, it allows the will of the people by shrouding itself upon its throne, a throne of popularism. The deuce speaks to the people, their popular interests and concerns with the future of their nation taken into serious account. Because individuals are weak when alone, though when forming a collective, able to gain strength, the hierarchy over all political decisions, all modes of social organization, the national economy, the corporate bodies which link together, branching off into syndicates, to harmonize all interest groups under the warm radius of the state, is able to exercise their line of authority in favor of the people, not against them. The deuce is the person who stops you from hurting yourself, from making all the bad decisions you would if no one were to stop you. The deuce, as an extension of yourself, is only real because you concede them, is the fullest, most romantic and heroic version of yourself, the best version of you there is. They force you to behave the way you've always wanted to behave, to become assertive, take risks, live life like a lion to its fullest, and take pride in one's labor and family, to embrace the radical traditionalism and cultural values spiritually inherent to one's nation, its mythological history. Because everything legitimate can only exist within the state, just as everything legitimate can only exist within the mind. The head of the fascist state is absolute, just as our conception is. They act as the will of all consciousness, binding us together as one, to stand strong as a national community, historically and geographically defined, and decide as the populist representative of the people what's best for us, what should and shouldn't be legal, and what shall be criminalized. The fascist turns not to matter to determine morality, for there is no matter regarding morality. Instead, they turn to the ideal, the moral sentimentalist sphere of governance, the head of state, someone who's responsible to the people because they're a person of dignity and law. They're the one consciousness deciding what's right and wrong, a visible figment of everyone's existence. Because of this, one can claim that the system of governments fascism utilizes, because the deuce is the embodiment of the people's conception of life as a constantly struggling and active essence, is, in an abstract sense, democratic. Yes, autocracy, if it is idealist, forms a strange variant of democracy, since the will of the deuce is the spiritual will of the people, only realized as opposed to asleep. For many, maybe most, of a nation's people don't know what's best for them, don't know what's right for them, but if made to move, to act, by a centralized force, they become so much happier, so much more dignified and formal, able to become fuller, more fleshed out versions of themselves. A national community think of the deuce as a dictator only in a way a child thinks of their parents as dictators, people who practice tough love selflessly for the sake of those they raise. If one were to look at it, a nation's children were once seeds from the soil, watered and fertilized by a gardener who desired to bring them to life, to grant them a physical appearance on this earth. Once they grew up, they were unable to move on their own. It could only be transformed from time to place by their caretaker. If the seeds were never watered, or ceased to be supported by someone of a greater height, they die out with the blazing sun. A child's parents think of them with love and kindness when they exhibit certain behaviors they see as damaging to their child, physically and emotionally harmful to their ethical and maturity-related development as a human being, from child to adult and later to their elderly years. Parents may prevent their child from doing certain things, but it's always out of an affection for them, since they never even think of doing the same for strangers or other parents' children, because the child is theirs, because they decide to raise them for the very act of taking care of them. They want them to live a happy and wonderful life, and part of that, a serious element of parenting, is being able to restrict the activities of their offspring. When they grow older, they're going to have more control and opportunity, but within their early years, living in their parents' house, they're denied certain freedoms so they can, in one sense, be free. Their parents, they know that engaging in underage sex or taking narcotics or refusing to go to bed on time isn't good for their children, will make the child the opposite of happy regardless of what they think in the moment. A child will enjoy their life when there's authority figures who surround them able to uplift them, to uphold the healthy, positive elements in life they need to experience, to absorb themselves in. In addition to this, a child must learn discipline, to perform chores such as cleaning their room, helping prepare dinner, serving peacefully in the house's garden, and lending a hand around the house, so that they can learn the joy of both physical exercise and the traditions of the family. In any healthy, disciplined nation, the practices and traditions of a family, the lively, energetic family found on affection, and the collectivism of blood, will naturally merge with that of a church and family. Family in themselves are a corporative body, a guild association which lends influence to the spiritual state, allowing for the national economy, under the fascist model of nationalistic corporatism, to serve these individual social structures. The economy under fascism would be built in a way that would allow all families enough personal finance to maintain themselves without divorce caused by economic bankruptcy or the impoverishing of their children who grew up to hate their nation in return. The model of corporatism, where traditional, healthy families work with the state and with its national spirit, would ensure all material units have the standard of living they need to continue their practices of civil tradition. What did Hegel have to say about the state? What was his view in regards to his idealism? Allow me to read quite a bit of what he wrote on the metaphysical abstraction known as the state. His examination of the state as a spiritual philosophical entity is possibly the first of its kind, deviating from liberal and socialist conceptions that place the state beneath the individual, as opposed to Hegel's view and the view of fascism, which states that everything, all materials and persons, can exist only within the state. The state is the actuality of the ethical idea. It is ethical mind qua the substantial will manifest and revealed to itself, knowing and thinking itself, accomplishing what it knows, and insofar as it knows it. The state exists immediately in custom, immediately in individual self-consciousness, knowledge, and activity, while self-consciousness in virtue of its sentiment towards the state finds in the state and its essence and the end product of its activity its substantive freedom. The penates are inward gods, gods of the underworld, the mind of a nation. Orphine, for instance, is the divine knowing and willing itself. Family piety is feeling, ethical behavior directed by feeling. A political virtue is the willing of the absolute end in terms of thought. The state is absolutely rational inasmuch as it is the actuality of the substantial will which it possesses in the particular self-consciousness. Once that consciousness has been raised to consciousness of its universality, this substantial unity is an absolute unmoved end in itself, in which freedom comes into its supreme right. On the other hand, this final end has supreme right against the individual, whose supreme duty is to be a member of the state. If the state is confused with civil society, and if its specific end is laid down as the security and protection of property and personal freedom, then the interest of the individuals as such becomes the ultimate end of their association. And it follows that membership of the state is something optional. But the state's relation to the individual is quite different from this. Since the state is mind objectified, it is only as one of its members that the individual himself has objectivity, genuine individuality, and an ethical life. Unification pure and simple is the true content and aim of the individual, and the individual's destiny is the living of the universal life. His further particular satisfaction, activity, and mode of conduct had the substantive and universally valid life as their starting point and the result. Rationality, taken generally and in the abstract, consists in the thoroughgoing unity of the universe and the singular. Rationality, concrete in the state, consists so far as its content is concerned in the unity of objective freedom, freedom of the universal of substantial will, and subjective freedom, freedom of everyone in his knowing and in his volition of particular ends, and consequently, so far as its form is concerned, is self-determining action on law and principles, which are thoughts and so universal. The idea is the absolutely eternal and necessary being of mind. But if we ask what is or has been the historical origin of the state in general, still more if we ask about the origin of any particular state, of its rights and institutions, or again if we inquire whether the state originally rose out of patriarchal conditions, or out of fear or of trust, or out of corporations, and so on, or finally if we ask in what light the basis of the state's rights had been conceived and consciously established, whether this basis has been supposed to be positive divine right, or contract, custom, so on, all these questions are no concern of the idea of the state. We are here dealing exclusively with the philosophic science of the state, and from that point of view, all these things are mere appearance, and therefore matters for history. So far as the authority of any existing state has anything to do with reasons, these reasons are cured from the forms of the law authoritative within it. The philosophical treatment of these topics is concerned only with their inward side, with the thought of their concept. The merit of Rousseau's contribution to the search for this concept is that, by adding the will as the principle of the state, he is adducing a principle which has thought both for its form and its content, a principle indeed which is thinking itself, not a principle, like gregarious instinct for instance, or divine authority, which has thought as its form only. Unfortunately, however, as Fichte did later, he takes the will only in a determined form, as the individual will, and he regards the universal will not as the absolutely rational element in the will, but only as a general will which proceeds out of this individual will and out of a conscious will. The result is that he reduces the union of individuals in the state to a contract, and therefore to something based on their arbitrary wills, their opinion, and their capriciously given express consent. And abstract reasoning proceeds to draw the logical interferences which destroy the absolutely divine principle of the state, together with its majesty and absolute authority. For this reason, when these abstract conclusions came into power, they thwarted for the first time in human history the prodigious spectacle of the overthrow of the constitution of a great actual state, and its complete reconstruction, albeit into on the basis of pure thought alone, after the destruction of all existing and given material. The will of its refounders was to give it what they alleged was a purely rational basis, but it was only abstractions that were being used. The idea was lacking, and the experiment ended in the maximum of frightfulness and terror. Confronted with the claims made for the individual will, we must remember the fundamental conception that the objective will is rationality, implicit or in conception, whether it be recognized or not by individuals, whether the whims be deliberately for it or not. We must remember that its opposite, knowing and willing, or subjective freedom, the only thing contained in the principle of the individual will, comprises only one moment, and therefore a one-sided moment of the idea of the rational will, i.e. of the will which is rational solely because what it is implicitly, that it also is explicitly. The opposite of thinking of the state as something to be known and apprehended as explicitly rational is taking external appearances, i.e. contingencies such as distress, need for protection, force, riches, so on, not as moments in the state's historical development, but as its substance. Here again, what constitutes the guiding shred of discovery is the individual in isolation, not, however, even so much as the thought of this individuality, but instead only empirical individuals, with attention focused on their accidental characteristics, their strength and weakness, riches and poverty, so on. This ingenious idea of ignoring the absolute infinity and rationality in the state and excluding thought from apprehension of its inward nature has assuredly never been put forward in such an unadulterated form as in Hermann Holler's— sorry, I can't pronounce that, it's a weird long German word. I say unadulterated because in all other attempt to grasp the essence of the state, no matter on what one-sided or superficial principles, this very intention of comprehending the state rationally has brought with it thoughts, universal determinations. Hermann Holler, however, with his eyes open, has not merely renounced the rational material of which the state consists as well as the form of thought, but he has even gone on with passionate fervor to inveigh against the form and the material so set aside. Part of what Herr von Haller assures us is the widespread effect of his principles. The restoration undoubtedly owes to the fact that, in his exposition, he has deliberately dispensed with thought altogether, and has deliberately kept his whole book all of a piece with its lack of thought. For in this way, he has eliminated the confusion and disorder which lessen the force of an exposition, where the accidental is treated alone with hints of the substantial, with the purely empirical and external unmixed, with a reminiscence of the universal and rational, and where in the midst of wretched inanities the reader is now and again reminded of the loftier sphere of the infinite. For the same reason, again, his exposition is consistent. He takes as the essence of the state, not what is substantive, but the sphere of accident. A consistency in dealing with a sphere of that kind amounts to the complete inconsistency of utter faultlessness, which jogs along without looking behind, and is just as much at home now with the exact opposite of what is approved a moment ago. The state in and by itself is the ethical whole, the actualization of freedom, and it is an absolute end of reason that freedom should be actual. The state is mind on earth and consciously realizing itself there. In nature, on the other hand, mind actualizes itself only as its own other, as mind asleep, only when it is present in consciousness, when it knows itself as a really existing object. Is it the state? In considering freedom, the starting point must not be individuality, the second self-consciousness, but only the essence of self-consciousness. For whether man knows it or not, this essence is externally realized as a self-subsistent power in which single individuals are only moments. The march of God in the world, that is what the state is. The basis of the state is the power of reason actualizing itself as will. In considering the idea of the state, we must not have our eyes on particular states or on particular institutions. Instead, we must consider the idea, this actual God, by itself. On some principle or other, any state may be shown to be bad, this or that defect may be found in it, and yet, at any rate, if one of the mature states of our approach is in question, it has in its moments essential to the existence of the state. But since it is easier to find defects than to understand the affirmative, we may readily fall into the mistake of looking at isolated aspects of the state instead of forgetting its inward organic life. The state is no ideal work of art. It stands on earth, and so, in the sphere of caprice, chance, error, and bad behavior may disfigure it in many respects. But the ugliest of man, or a criminal, or invalid, or a cripple, it's still always a living man. The affirmative life subsists despite his defects, and it is this affirmative factor which is our theme here. So Hegel's saying the state is flawed, but it's the best system we have, it's the best kind of social organization. And contrary to the view of those who support democracy, claiming that's the best system or the least evil system, it's the opposite way for Hegel. Hegel sees faults in the state, of course. The fascist today knows that the state they live under, the liberal state, is not their state. It doesn't represent them. But compared to no state, and especially with the opportunity of shaping a spiritual nationalist dictatorship, that opportunity always possible through revolutionary nationalism, the state is the best answer to controlling people and ushering in a perfect, brilliant social order. The state in its actuality is essentially an individual state, and beyond that, a particular state. Individuality is to be distinguished from particularity. The former is a moment in the very idea of the state, while the latter belongs to history. States as such are independent of one another, and therefore the relation to one another can only be an external one, so that there must be a third thing standing above them to bind them together. Now this third thing is the mind, which gives itself actuality in world history, and is the absolute judge of states. Several states may form an alliance to be a sort of court with jurisdiction over others. There may be confederations of states, like the Holy Alliance for example, but these are always relative only and restricted, like perpetual peace. The one and only absolute judge, which makes itself authoritative against the particular and at all ends, is the absolute mind, which manifests itself in the history of the world, is the universal, and as the genesis, there operative. For Hegel, the absolute state, as the will of God, is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be the solution. The end to all social troubles, to all woes under feudal and capitalist society, to all suffering and cultural decadence, to everything vicious discovered in the modern world, is through the power that is the state. A might makes right situation. The utilization of violence by the state is to keep its people in line, so that they may keep others in line, and thus creating a self-regulating national community, upholding the values, laws, and social order ushered in by the spiritual absolute state, unbound by any constitutional restrictions on what the deuce is able to do. Because all physical existence is merely a product of the mind, including exercise, this means that action is dependent upon mind, not independent, never separated, and always one, whole, absolute. Our actions, our physical movement is created through our mind causing our organs to perform the functions we positively imagine them to. So all violence utilized by the absolute state is the will of our mind, a moral and always conceiving consciousness, because our mind is found within the supreme authority, the ruler of a fascist nation. Inactivity is death. If the mind stops functioning, is unaware what's in front of it, nothing at all is in front of it. Nothing exists, and all the beauty in the world and the universe has died off. To stop acting, to live without adventure, bravery, heroism, and passion, is to have deceased. Act is mind created, and the mind itself pure act. The state, by making people live their lives to the fullest possible, to be the greatest variants of themselves, has successfully kept action going, fierce and powerful, so that our minds have something incredible to conceive. Within the state, Hegel formulated another theoretical view, that of corporative bodies performing their roles within a system of vertical governments. Corporatism, which is a very relevant element of fascism, is the ideology advocating that society should be broken up into corporate groups, individually their own living organisms, which specialize in certain fields of labor, study, or entertainment. For example, what existed in medieval Europe with the guild system, craftsmen and merchants having established their own collective associations, where they were provided for by their community, and in return fulfilled their end of the bargain, giving back by means of their labor the materials they were granted. A school is a guild association because it brings children, students, into one shared space where they're taught certain fields of education of the world surrounding them. In the theory of corporatism, interest groups would either have their own organizations to represent them, becoming stronger through numbers, or such interest groups would directly be incorporated into the absolute state. A major example of this would be a theocracy, where a state's legal system is derived from religious scripture, an inherently idealist system of governments, since God and religious law are immaterial, something only created by the mind, and thus incompatible with materialism. Theocracy is, without really needing to say this, it's pretty stereotypical of fascism anyway, a system of governance compatible with fascism, this philosophy of anti-positivist collectivism. Within what exists of fascism, corporatism is both nationalist and centralized, working within the framework of industrial capitalism, where capitalists privately own and control instruments of production and workplace facilities, represented by state mandatory employers organizations, their corporate group claimed by the fascist state, employing large quantities of wage laborers, who, in turn, are represented by their state mandatory corporate group, nationalized trade unions. Since both trade unions and employers organizations in fascism are undertaken by the state has surveillance and say over all changes to the national economic plan set. It settles disputes by utilizing the trade unions and employers organizations between labor and capital. Sometimes labor will win, other times it'll be capital. The fascist state decides these things and finds it easier to have guilds cling to the performances of both workers and employers, so that, in overseeing production in the corporatist economy, both financial classes find themselves collaborating to work in favor of the nation, always within its religious embodiment. The agriculturalist state. In Friedrich Hegel's The Philosophy of Right, he writes, The agricultural estate, in view of the substantiality of its natural and family life, has within itself, in immediate form, the concrete universal in which it lives. The universal estate, by definition, has the universal for itself as its basis and as the end of its activity. The intermediate state, i.e., the state of trade and industry, is essentially concerned with the particular, and the corporation is therefore especially characteristic of it. The work performed by civil society is divided into different branches according to its particular nature. Since the inherent likeness of such particulars, it's the quality common to them all, comes into existence in the association, the selfish end, which pursues its own particular interest, comprehends and expresses itself at the same time as the universal end. And the member of civil society, in accordance with his particular skill, is a member of a corporation whose universal end is therefore wholly concrete, and no wider in scope than the end inherent in the trade, which is the corporation's proper business and interest. By this definition, the corporation has the right, under the supervision of the public authority, he means the state by the way, to look after its own interests within its enclosed sphere, to emit numbers in accordance with their objective qualifications of skill and rectitude against particular contingencies, and to educate others so as to make them eligible for membership. In short, it has the right to assume the role of a second family for its members, a role which must remain more indeterminate in the case of civil society in general, which is more remote than individuals, and the particular requirements. The tradesman is distinct from the day laborer, as he is from someone who is prepared to perform an occasional contingent service. The former, who is or wishes to become a master, is a member of an association not for occasional contingent gain, but for the whole range and universality of his particular livelihood. Privileges, in the sense of rights of a branch of civil society which constitute a corporation, are distinct from privileges proper in the anthropological sense, i.e. in that the latter are contingent exceptions to the universal law, whereas the former are no more than legally fixed determinations which lie in a particular nature of an essential branch of civil society. In the corporation, the family not only has its firm basis in that its livelihood is guaranteed, i.e. has secure resources, of condition of its possessing a certain capability, but the two, i.e. livelihood and capability, are also recognized, so that the member of a corporation has no need to demonstrate his competence and his regular income and means of support, i.e. the fact that he is somebody, by any further external evidence. In this way, it is also recognized that he belongs to a whole, which is itself a member of society in general, that he has an interest in, and endeavors to promote the less selfish end of this whole. Thus, he has his honor in his estate. As a guarantor of resources, the institution of the corporation corresponds to the introduction of agriculture and private property in another sphere. When complaints are made about the luxury and love, extravagance of the professional classes, which is associated with the creation of a rebel, we must not overlook, in addition to the other causes of this phenomenon, the increasingly mechanical nature of work. Its ethical basis is implied in what has been said above. If the individual is not a member of a legally recognized corporation, and it is only through legal organization that a community becomes a corporation, he is without the honor of belonging to an estate. His isolation reduces him to the selfish aspect of his trade, and his livelihood and satisfaction lacks stability. He will incoherently try to gain recognition through the external manifestations of success in his trade, and these are without limit, because it is impossible for him to live in a way appropriate to his estate if his estate does not exist. For a community can exist in civil society only if it is legally constituted and recognized. Hence, no way of life of a more general kind appropriate to such an estate can be devised without the corporation. The help which poverty receives loses the contingent and unjustly humiliating character, and wealth, in fulfilling the duty it owes to its association, loses the ability to revoke arrogance in its possessor and envy in others. Rectitude also receives the true recognition and honor which are due to it. In the corporation, the so-called natural right to practice one's skill and thereby earn what there is to earn is limited only to the extent that, in this context, the skill is rationally demanded. That is, it is free from personal opinion and contingency, from its danger to oneself and others, and is recognized, guaranteed, and at the same time raised to a conscious activity for a common end. The family is the first ethical root of the state. The corporation is the second, and it is based in civil society. The former contains the moments of subjective particularity and objective universality in substantial unity. But in the latter, these movements, which in civil society are at first divided into the eternally reflected particularity of need and satisfaction and abstract legal universality, are inwardly united in such a way that particular welfare is present as a right and is actualized within this union. The sanctity of marriage and the honor attaching to the corporation are the two movements round which the disorganization of civil society revolves. When the corporations were abolished in recent times, it was with the intention that the individual should look after himself. But even if we accept this, the corporation does not affect the individual's obligation to earn his living. In our modern states, the citizens have only a limited share in the universal business of the state, but it is necessary to provide an ethical man with universal activity in addition to his private end. This universal activity, which the modern state does not always offer him, can be found in the corporation. We saw earlier that in providing for himself, the individual in civil society is also acting for others. But this unconscious necessity is not enough. Only in the corporation does it become a knowing and thinking part of ethical life. The corporation, of course, must come under the higher supervision of the state, for it would otherwise become ostracized and set in its own ways, and decline into a miserable guild system. But the corporation in and for itself is not an enclosed guild, it is rather a means of giving the isolated trade in ethical status, and of admitting it to a circle in which it gains strength and honor. The end of the corporation, which is limited and finite, has its truth in the end which is universal, in and for itself, and in the absolute actuality of this end. So likewise do the separation and relative identity, which was present in the external organization of the police. The sphere of civil society thus passes over into the state. To differentiate Hegel's view on corporatism with, say, socialist and anti-state variations of the same broad system, while Hegel didn't advocate for the centralized kind of corporatism practical fascism later did, it was contrasted with the activity of the state. The spirit operates in and is maintained and linked to the ability and value of the state, so that both corporate groups and the state can harmoniously coexist, fulfilling the functions of one another. After all, production is still oversaw by the state within the framework of these individual corporations. It is therefore, in a sense, pro-state and pro-collectivism, building social structures within the framework of the state, not outside it. Just because the state doesn't own and control these organized interest groups to the extent that, under practical fascism they did, doesn't mean they don't function for the sake and soul of the spiritual state. And seeing capitalism didn't exist in Hegel's time, taking note that he existed prior to the Industrial Revolution across Europe, his theory of corporatism, of organization by means of corporations, was of course going to be different. It had to be. Now, to elaborate upon Hegel's vision of a romantic nationalism, I'll provide some quotations from the German philosopher to clarify his position on what the nation meant to him, emotionally, and how he saw the Germans as needing a territorial domain to secure their existence as a unique, identifiable people, the nation itself serving as a corporative body for which its citizens will find freedom in. In our times, there is no need for integration or unity in the states as far as custom, tradition, culture, and language are concerned. The dialects of many provinces of France and England differ from the dominant tongue. In Wales and the Hebrides, English is not spoken at all. The Austrian and Russian monarchs do not even know how many languages are spoken in their states, and precisely their states are models of the modern state, whose integration arises from the spirit and unity of a common political consciousness. Very prominent is Kustok in the consciousness of the fatherland. As a poet, he sensed the need for a rooted mythology whose names and forms should be composed in themselves, as a solid base for fantasy. It may be said that out of national pride, Kustok tried to revive the mythology of Waffen, Herter, and the rest. All he succeeded in doing was that the names of the gods took on German instead of Greek forms, and no more. Kustok attained to no greater influence in objective actuality than a man who endeavors to argue that the empirical diet of Regensburg can constitute the ideal of our present national existence. These gods who have sunk into oblivion will always remain hollow and false, and a good deal of hypocrisy is needed to pretend that this fantasy is reconcilable with intelligence and with the present consciousness of the nation. Similarly, so long as the Jewish state found spirit and strength enough in itself for the maintenance of its independence, the Jews seldom, or, as many held, never had recourse to the expectations of a Messiah. Not until they were subjugated by foreign nations, not until they had a sense of their importance and weakness, do we find them borrowing in the sacred books for a consolation of that kind. Then, when they were offered a Messiah who did not fulfill their political expectations, thought it was worth toiling to ensure that their state should still remain a state. A nation, to which this is a matter of indifference, will soon cease to become a nation. They very soon discarded their ineffective, messianic hopes and took up arms. In history and the judgment of nations, they would stand alongside the Carthaginians and Constantines, and above the Greeks and Romans, whose cities outlived their politics. If the sense of what a nation may do for its independence were not too foreign to us. Great revolutions which strike the eye at a glance, much have been preceded by a still and secret revolution in the spirit of the age. Zeitgeist, a revolution not visible to every eye, especially imperceptible to contemporaries, and is hard to discern as to describe in words. It is lack of acquaintance with the spiritual revolution which makes the resulting changes astonishing. Now, you might have noticed a very strange word being used in that lost quotation. Zeitgeist. An obscure word of German origin, Zeitgeist literally means spirit of the age, or alternatively, spirit of the times, referring to the spirit embodying a nation at a select time, due to the patriotic essence of a people who inhabit it, whether prevalent or absent. The nation, in Hegel's view, has spiritual, intangible, and extraordinary characteristics, virtues, and elements of endurance. A zeitgeist is most pronounced when a people believe in their national sovereignty, find themselves engulfed by the culture, identity, and political actions of their nation. A zeitgeist disappears, however, the weaker a people's passion for their nation becomes, until they have no passion, to which the spiritual nation has lost its spirit, and therefore ceases to exist. The way a fascist may recommend getting a people involved and caring for their nation is by means of myth-making. The myth must be honest, endearing, and representing the inherent national character of a country, the country in question. Tell a story of a nation's past, a people's past, creating a belief in the narrative elaborated upon, so that the future generations will tell their children the same stories, and then, when they have offspring of their own, their children will be told the same tales, the cycle repeating. This is what sustains religious faiths, gives folklore the life it has today, and adds an internal essence to the idea of nations. Another word, Volksgeist, also used by Hegel in his writing, means national spirit, the spiritual wave a nation swims. A shorter version of this is simply Volk, a word that was often used by Adolf Hitler to refer to Germanic people in racial terms. Romantic nationalism holds that a nation should derive its personality and traits from the people it lays governance over, much like how the dictator of a fascist state is representative of the will, spirits, and hearts of their people. This could be on the basis of ethnicity, culture, religion, language, or ideology. In Hegel's case, the national spirit of the German people was to come and go. But when it arrived, inhabiting Germans so they could feel deep, sentimental forces within their nation, it struck hard, creating new men and women out of their former selves, allowing for extreme patriotism, traditionalism, and national heroism to take hold of their beating flesh and blood hearts. Hegel, being a religious theist and idealist, and allowing this ideological background to influence his views on politics, gave wholeness to the nation, the state, and the corporative associations which acted between them. The nation was defined in romantic terms and the state residing as an absolute entity. Because of this, the nation exists within the state, for the state is able to give life to animate, or immaterial properties and social constructions that would have been completely ignored, if nationalism didn't rise up and claim such inventions as possessing a cute spiritual character. Friedrich Hegel, by the writings from his pen, was able to greatly influence the second major philosophical founder of fascism, Giovanni Gentile of Italy. Giovanni's views on the state, nation, and on metaphysics, alongside how idealism is applied to political organization, is perfectly in line with that of Hegel's beliefs. Being a right-wing Hegelian, Giovanni Gentile came to oppose the materialism advocated by Karl Marx and his ideological followers, instead believing that all life and existence is immaterial, a product of the mind. and thus cannot be explained in environmental determinist terms, as one would have with the philosophies of Marx, historical and dialectical materialism. Giovanni's theory of actual idealism, that being the ontology of idealism applied to politics and the human spirit, is best described as a synonym for fascism. Fascism, alternatively called actual idealism, is simply, in the most simple terms and basic principles, the application of this ontological idealism to the political sphere, the method of governance, and to spiritual internal matters, resulting in the upholding of a palingenetic nation-state whose positive attraction transcends the material realm. We're all unified, socially collectivist nationals within this mythical creature, are reborn as new men and women, embracing the values of radical tradition, family, labor, honor, faith, fatherland, and constant, never-ceasing action. Everything is act in one capacity or another. At this point of the video, something of extreme importance needs to be addressed, and that's Hegel's ideological relationship with a different figure, someone greatly relevant to Gentile, that being Karl Marx, the founder of scientific socialism. Marx, who was a materialist metaphysician, was greatly influenced by Hegel, just like Gentile, and applied his history, his theory of dialectics to that of class struggle. Hegelian dialectics asserts that arguments, heated conversations, and all manner of controversy span the course of three identifiable stages. Thesis, a statement or opinionated position which gives rise to a response. Antithesis, a counterclaim or counter-argument against the thesis. And finally, the synthesis, where a conclusion has been reached, typically a compromise. In Karl Marx's materialist view of history, and the means of production and exchange which have developed and evolved with every changing range of environments, the socialist puts forth their thesis. They want to own the instruments that allow for labor to commence, first by having possession over them, and due to this, shall be able to exercise physical energy upon such property independent of a master, someone who forces a worker to labor for them, and not for the worker's own individual autonomy. The socialist is asking for self-management within the confines of their work, to have the ability to choose how they work and the surrounding conditions of the work. If socialism were to replace capitalism, wage labor would cease to exist, and all physically existing individuals would become self-employed, either working in one-person firms or managing production cooperatively in an economic democracy. Then, as expected, the opposition to socialism arises from the capitalists, the antithesis. Not a surprise, they are employers, private owners of industry after all. However, another demographic finds itself opposing socialism, that being part of the proletariat themselves. Marx and Engels point out this is a creation of a false consciousness, a misguided belief manufactured by bourgeois society to indoctrinate the workers into disobeying their own class, to believe their oppression is justified or non-existent. Then, at last, arrives a synthesis. Marx concludes that the proletariat needs proletarian, not bourgeois, environments in order to foster a healthy perception of their class, and to be awakened to the light of class consciousness. The end conclusion is that, within the sociological field of environmental determinism, false consciousness is incredibly easy to spread when the capitalist state isn't forcing itself upon the people from above. Now, understanding Karl Marx's takeaway from Hegel, some of the content Hegel's written, that is, we know his theory is making sense, we can see that, as being relevant to the revolutionary class politics of socialism and communism he was getting at, advocating for the erasure of private production. And out of all the socialist and communist philosophy, there exists an inherently material character to such theories, contrary to the idealism of Hegel and Gentile. Marx at no point, however, claimed Hegel was a socialist, anti-statist, or any school of leftist, even though the term left and right politically weren't used that often back then. Merely he took what he wanted, as fascists do frequently, and added it to his study of sociology. It's not Marx here who I have a problem with. There is a group, however, that I very much come to despise. At first, I was only slightly annoyed by them, being more far left at the time, but now I've came to absolutely loathe these fools. This dates back to the First International, to anti-capitalists and leftists who were inspired by Hegel, who call themselves young Hegelians, or left Hegelians, having formed a progressive materialist interpretation of his philosophy. Nowadays, young Hegelians are unfortunately far more prevalent than old Hegelians, also known as right Hegelians, still exist and continue to misinterpret Hegel's views. See, it's no exaggeration the left call anyone they disagree with fascists and Nazis. I've been viciously called a fascist and Nazi repeatedly by these idiots, even when I was less, warm to fascism. But here, most ironically, they are praising an actual fascist. And not just any fascist, mind you. Friedrich Hegel, out of all the theorists of fascism, can rightfully be stated to be the first theoretical fascist there is. Of course, as I've said near the beginning of this video, fascism dates all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome, but no one can properly be called a fascist from that point, merely that the human spirit of fascism was thick in their atmospheres. Hegel, however, was the first true philosopher of fascist metaphysics, and willing to apply such metaphysics to political organization and national spirit. His advocacy of the absolute state, national corporatism, and a romantic spiritual character given to an historical people, to unite them by means of nation and tradition, exists in contrast to anything the left ask for. If they advocate corporatism, it's outside of nations and outside of states. If they advocate giving an historical people a certain identity, it's only a proletarian one, or to anyone who isn't white, I guess. Young Hegelianism, if it's not referring to Marxist theory of the proletariat losing its change by means of a synthesis, which is agreeable in its approach to granting working people their natural rights, is at best merely inaccurate and ill-informed, not correct, but at worst, absolute worst, what I'm leaning towards is abysmal and disingenuous, a distortion of what Hegel believed, neglecting the vast impact Hegel had on the orthodox fascist movement and the abstraction that fascism was within his own mind. You can't simultaneously be a Hegelian and a leftist. Hegelian nationalism and spiritual statism would be lost within your formula. And to mention, there's other stuff leftists almost definitely wouldn't approve of from Hegel. His literal justification for economic inequality, seeing it as ethically acceptable, which certainly wasn't very socialistic, and he's not so positive views towards racial Africans. Anyway, I think we can conclude the facts about Friedrich Hegel. For those wanting to study him further, the founder of fascism, there's a great literary publication I recommend for fascists, Hegel's Theory of the Modern State, a book by Shlomo Avery. It covers Hegel's theory of the state and its relevance to his views on social issues, what we can learn in the modern day from this dialogue and various other interesting things. Certainly a pleasant, wonderful read. Definitely something you should look at if you want to know more about this. Oh, and one other thing, if you're watching this and you want other fascists to know about the true Hegel, not the false Hegel the political left often advertise, lie about, share this video far and wide, every platform is able to reach fascists. Thanks for watching, and take good care.